Dog stuck in mud puddle. Rescuer is shocked when he sees what's hiding under the dog. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town, the kind of day where nothing much happens. The rain had come and gone, leaving the fields drenched, puddles reflecting the gray sky. The air smelled of damp earth and everything felt heavy and still. In the distance, a lone figure could be seen trudging along the muddy road, a familiar sight to the locals. Walter, a retired firefighter, had taken his daily walk despite the soggy conditions. He didn't mind the mud. It reminded him of simpler times, when life was slower and the world felt a little more predictable. As he walked, his eyes wandered across the open fields, taking in the landscape. The grass, usually vibrant and green, was now weighing down by the moisture, patches of it submerged under shallow pools of water. Walter sighed, thinking about how the town would be busy cleaning up the mess from the storm for days. But as he reached the far side of the field, something caught his attention. Welcome back to PlotTwister. Before we unravel today's mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. At first, it was just a white shape, barely noticeable in the distance, blending into the landscape. Walter squinted, his heart skipping a beat. There, lying in the middle of a large mud puddle, was Axton, the town's beloved white dog. His body was half submerged in the thick mud, only his head visible, ears twitching slightly, eyes wide and focused. For a moment, Walter thought Axton was just resting, maybe cooling off and wandering through the wet fields. But something about the scene felt off. The dog wasn't moving. He wasn't barking or whining, just lying there. Walter's pulse quickened. He knew Axton well. This wasn't normal behavior for him. He picked up his pace, his boots squelching through the mud as he hurried over. As he got closer, the uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger. Axton's eyes followed him, but the dog didn't try to get up, didn't even attempt to shift. Something was wrong, and Walter was about to find out what. Walter reached Axton, his heart pounding as he crouched beside the dog. Mud splattered up around his knees, but he didn't care. Axton's wide brown eyes looked up at him, calm yet pleading, as if trying to tell him something. Walter spoke softly to him, hoping the sound of his voice would offer some comfort. The dog remained still, only his head resting above the thick mud. Walter reached out, gently grabbing Axton by the collar and giving a light tug, expecting him to spring out or at least shift, but nothing happened. Axton didn't move a muscle. Walter frowned, tightening his grip and pulling harder this time. The mud held the dog in place like a heavy, unbreakable weight. Walter felt a knot form in his stomach. He had pulled dogs from mud before, but something about this felt different. Axton was struggling or whining. He just lay there almost unnaturally still. Walter wiped the rainwater and sweat from his brow, his hand now covered in wet dirt. He bent down, placing both hands under Axton's chest, trying to lift him up out of the mud, but it was of no use. The mud was thick, clinging to the dog's body as if it had swallowed him whole. Axton's calmness unnerved Walter even more. Why wasn't he trying to get out? Why was he just waiting? As Walter stepped back to catch his breath, he noticed something strange. Axton's eyes weren't focused on him. The dog wasn't looking at Walter for help. His gaze was fixed downward, toward the ground beneath him. It was as if Axton was watching something else or guarding it. Walter's chest tightened. There was something else going on here, something he couldn't yet understand. He knelt down again, closer this time, running his hands along the sides of Axton's body, trying to figure out what was holding him so firmly. As his fingers dug into the mud, he felt it, a resistance beneath the dog, something solid and unmoving. And suddenly, the quiet afternoon didn't feel so ordinary anymore. Walter's mind raced as he knelt beside Axton, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. His hands had definitely hit something beneath the mud, something firm. He stood up, glancing around, desperate for anything that could help. Not far off, he spotted a thick branch buried half in the ground, the kind of thing kids use to play sword fights. Without hesitation, he rushed over, yanking it free from the wet earth, and hurried back to Axton. He wedged the branch under Axton's body, hoping to pry him loose from the mud. The dog didn't fight, didn't even flinch. Walter pushed with all his strength, feeling his muscles strain against the resistance of the thick mud. Slowly, inch by inch, Axton's body began to lift, but it was an exhausting battle. The mud clung to the dog as if it didn't want to let go. Thick and relentless. Walter groaned with the effort, his boots slipping slightly in the muck. As he worked, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that Axton was unusually calm. He should be wriggling, trying to help himself out of the mud. But instead he lay completely still, his gaze still focused downward. Walter's curiosity grew, mingling with his concern. What was keeping Axton so still? A noise broke Walter's concentration, voices in the distance. Martha and Jeremy, a couple from the neighborhood, were walking along the road, probably enjoying the cooler weather after the rain. Walter waved them over, calling for help. The couple rushed over, their faces turning to concern when they saw Axton trapped in the mud. Together, the three of them worked to free the dog. Jeremy used the branch to dig deeper, clearing more mud away from Axton's body, while Martha knelt beside the dog, stroking his head and whispering soothing words. But as they worked, Walter noticed something else. There was more resistance beneath the mud than they expected. It wasn't just the weight of the mud holding Axton down. Walter felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in his chest. This wasn't a simple rescue anymore. Something was beneath Axton, something he couldn't see yet. But whatever it was keeping the dog frozen in place. Walter's hands were shaking now. He wasn't sure if it was the cold, the effort, or the growing sense that something was very wrong. They had cleared most of the mud around Axton's body, but the dog still wasn't trying to move. It didn't make any sense. Axton had always been a strong dog, eager to run and play. But now he was almost unnaturally still. Walter exchanged a quick glance with Martha, who was still gently petting the dog's head, her eyes filled with worry. Jeremy kept digging, using the branch to loosen more of the thick mud. The ground was starting to give way, but each time they thought they were close to freeing Axton, they hit something solid again. Walter crouched back down, his hands disappearing into the wet earth. His fingers dug deeper, searching for the source of the resistance. And then he felt it, something small, soft, and warm. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned in closer, brushing away the mud with his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The object he had touched wasn't a rock or a root. It was something alive. Walter's mind raced as his fingers gently moved more mud away, revealing a patch of fur. His eyes widened in disbelief. There beneath Axton was a tiny figure barely visible under the thick layer of mud. It was moving, but just barely. A small, weak wriggle, almost as if it were struggling to breathe. Walter could feel his pulse racing now, his hands moving faster as he uncovered more. The mud gave way, slowly revealing a tiny body, curled up tightly beneath Axton's protective frame. Martha gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as she realized what they were seeing. Jeremy stopped digging, frozen in place, his eyes locked on the small creature beneath the dog. None of them spoke for a moment, the weight of the discovery sinking in. Walter's voice was barely a whisper as he gently lifted the small, fragile form from the mud. His heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary rescue. Walter cradled the tiny mud-covered creature in his hands, his heart racing. He could feel it breathing, shallow and weak, but alive. Axton finally shifted, the tension in his body releasing as he stood up, shaking off the mud. The dog seemed exhausted, but his eyes never left Walter's hands, as if making sure the fragile life he had been protecting was safe. Martha grabbed a towel from Jeremy's backpack, his hands trembling as she helped Walter wipe the mud away from the small form. Bit by bit, the creature came into focus. It was a puppy, no more than a few weeks old, covered in filth but unmistakably alive. Its tiny body shook as Martha wrapped it in the towel, holding it close to keep it warm. The realization of what Axton had been doing hit them all at once. The dog hadn't been stuck. He had stayed in that mud, unmoving to protect the puppy. He had shielded the tiny creature with his own body, keeping it safe and warm, despite the freezing rain and the thick clinging mud. Walter's throat tightened as he looked from Axton to the puppy. The dog had been guarding it, sacrificing his own comfort, maybe even his own safety, to ensure the puppy survived. It was as if Axton had known the whole time that the little one wouldn't make it without him. Jeremy stood back, shaking his head in disbelief. Martha held the puppy close, tears welling up in her eyes as the little thing let out a soft whimper. They were all quiet for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. The rain had nearly drowned this tiny life, but Axton had saved it. Against all odds, the puppy had survived. Walter gently patted Axton on the head, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't believe the bond the dog must have felt, the instinct to protect something so small and helpless. It was a scene both of them would never, ever forget. A moment where the courage and heart of a dog had made all the difference in the world. The next few hours passed in a blur. Walter, Martha, and Jeremy quickly bundled the puppy and Axton into Walter's truck and rushed them to the local vet. The entire ride, Axton lay with his head resting on the seat beside the puppy, his eyes never leaving the small bundle wrapped in Martha's arms. The puppy whimpered occasionally, but it was safe now, thanks to the dog who had refused to leave it behind. At the vet's office, they were greeted with wide-eyed surprise. The story of how Axton had shielded the puppy in the mud spread quickly. The vet carefully examined both dogs, making sure the puppy was stable and Axton was unharmed. Despite being covered in mud and exhausted, the puppy was healthy, its small lungs now breathing steadily. Axton, while worn out, was no worse for wear. As the vet cleaned up the dogs, Walter sat nearby watching them closely. He couldn't shake the awe he felt for Axton. How had the dog known to stay there, to protect that helpless little life for so long? The thought brought tears to Walter's eyes. This dog had done something remarkable, something that most people wouldn't believe if they hadn't seen it themselves. Martha and Jeremy stood by, their faces softened with relief. The puppy, now clean and wrapped in a fresh towel, wriggled slightly in Martha's arms, its small eyes fluttering open for the first time. Axton perked up, watching closely as if making sure everything was still okay. As the days passed, the bond between Axton and the puppy only grew stronger. The puppy, now lively and playful, followed Axton everywhere, nuzzling against him and learning from his every move. It was as if the two had become inseparable, bound by the experience they had shared in that muddy field. The town too embraced the heartwarming story. Neighbors would stop by Walter's house just to see the two dogs, patting Axton's head and marveling at his bravery. The puppy, now healthy and full of life, had been given a second chance, all because Axton had refused to leave him behind. And from that day forward, Axton and the puppy were never apart, a testament to the power of loyalty, love, and the incredible bond between them. What are your thoughts on the twist we uncovered today? Comment your ideas below. Make sure to like and subscribe for a daily dose of drama and mystery. See you later with another twist.